"Master Sergeant, I'd like to go again, if you've got the time." The pit was empty except for the two of them, and the light coming over the tree line was the thin gray of a morning that had not decided yet what it wanted to be. Specialist Cody Brandt stood at the edge of the sawdust, with his hands taped and his shoulders low, and there was nothing in his voice now of the man he had been 6 weeks earlier. He waited the way a young soldier waits when he has learned that waiting is a kind of respect. The woman he was speaking to was crouched by the low bench, retaping her own right hand over an old pale scar that ran the length of her forearm. She looked up at him without hurry. She always looked at everything without hurry. That was the first thing anyone learned about Renata Vaughn, and usually the last thing they learned before they understood everything else. "I've got the time," she said. "Warm up first. You still drop your hips a half-second late." He nodded like a man who had been given something. And it is worth stopping here, before the round begins, to go back and see how a loud young ranger had come to stand quiet in a cold pit and ask a woman he had once mocked for permission to be taught. Because 6 weeks earlier, the pit had not known her name. 6 weeks earlier, on a morning colder than this one, she had walked in a stranger, and a boy with a strong back and an easy laugh had looked at her and decided she was nothing at all. Go back to that morning. Go on, try me. The words came out of Cody Brandt loud enough to carry across the whole compound, and the ring of young rangers around the sawdust pit laughed the way men laugh when they are certain of the ending. It was 6:40 in the morning. Frost still held in the low places along the fence line, and the breath of 30 men hung over the pit like a second, thinner ceiling. Brandt stood in the center with his arms spread, turning slowly so the crowd could admire the offer he was making. He was 24 years old and built like something that had never once been told no, and he had aimed the whole performance at a woman sitting alone on the low bench at the edge of the sand. She did not answer him. She sat with a paper cup of coffee held in both hands, in a plain blue jacket zipped to the throat, and she looked at Brandt the way a person looks at weather. There was a duffel at her feet and a visitor's placard clipped to her collar, and every man in the pit had already decided what she was. A new medic, maybe. A clerk from the schoolhouse waiting on a signature. Somebody's ride. Somebody who had wandered in from the paved world and would wander back out of it as soon as the real work started. "I'm serious." Brandt grinned and dropped into a low, showy stance, patting the sawdust in front of him. "Free lesson. Come on. You've been sitting there staring at us for 20 minutes. You want a turn? Take a turn." The laughter came again, warmer this time, feeding on itself. The woman set the coffee down on the bench beside her. She did it slowly, without heat, the way you set down something you intend to pick up again. Then she folded her hands in her lap and returned Brandt's grin with a stillness that had no fear anywhere in it. And for just a moment, if any of them had been paying attention to the right thing, they might have felt the temperature of the morning change. None of them were paying attention to the right thing. Except one. Sergeant First Class Amos Ridley stood at the far corner of the pit with a clipboard he was not reading, and he was not watching Brandt at all. He was watching the woman. He was 44 years old and had spent 26 of them learning to tell, at a glance, the difference between a person who was afraid to move and a person who had simply decided not to. He had put his life on that difference more than once, and what he saw on the low bench was the second kind, and it made the coffee go cold in his own hand without his noticing. "Leave it, Brandt," Ridley said. His voice was even. "We've got a schedule." "I'm helping the schedule, Sergeant." Brandt straightened, playing to the ring. "Cross-training. Community outreach." He looked back at the woman and softened his voice into something that was meant to sound kind and did not. "No? Nothing? That's all right, ma'am. You just sit tight and watch how it's done." She said nothing, She picked the coffee back up, and the pit, satisfied, turned away from her and back to itself, and got on with the morning, not knowing it had just been offered its one clean chance to be wrong quietly, and had laughed it away. The class formed up, and the woman on the bench watched them the way she watched everything, and waited, because waiting, to her, had never once been the same thing as fear. The first tell came 15 minutes later, and only one man caught it. Ridley had the class working a simple thing, a body lock takedown, the kind of technique that looks like nothing and decides everything. He pulled Brant to the center to demonstrate, because Brant was strong and looked good doing it, and Brant threw his partner into the sand with a grunt and a flourish and came up hunting for applause. "Good," Ridley said, in the flat way that meant not good. "Now do it without telling the whole valley you're coming." He needed a pad held for the next drill, and the cadre who usually held it was down at the aid station with a rolled ankle, and so Ridley did a thing he would think about for a long time afterward. He looked at the woman on the bench, because she was the nearest set of hands, and he said, "Ma'am, would you mind? Just hold this, chest high." She rose without a word and crossed the sand and took the pad. And in the half-second it took her to set her feet, Ridley saw it. She did not brace the pad against her chest, the way a civilian braces a thing they are afraid of. She stacked her wrist behind it and turned her lead foot out and dropped her weight a fraction, so that the pad became not a shield, but a wall, rooted to the ground, through her hips. It was the stance of someone who had held pads for hard men and been knocked flat for holding them wrong, and had learned. It took less than a second. Then she was still again, unreadable, waiting. Brant drove into the pad and rebounded off it as if he had struck a doorframe. He blinked. "Again," Ridley said quietly, watching her now and not him. Brant hit it again, harder, and the woman gave up perhaps 2 inches of sand, and no more, and her expression did not change. "You're loading your right too early," she said. It was the first thing she had said all morning. Her voice was low and even, and carried no insult in it, only information, the way a mechanic tells you which bearing is going. You'll telegraph the level change. Against him it doesn't matter. Against someone who's waiting for it, you'll put your face where his knee already is. Brant laughed, but it came a half-beat late. "That's so. Watch." She said it to Ridley, not to Brant, and she nodded at the 2 students drilling to their left. "The tall one's about to shoot. He'll drop his eyes first. There." The tall student dropped his eyes, shot, and put his face exactly where his partner's knee already was, and sat down hard in the sand, with a noise like a dropped sandbag. It happened perhaps 1 second after she said it would. The pit did not notice. The pit was busy. But Ridley noticed, and something in the back of his neck had gone tight and cold, and he found himself looking at her forearm, where the sleeve had ridden up when she raised the pad. There was a scar there, long and pale and old, running from the wrist toward the elbow in the particular way that only one kind of thing makes, and he had seen that kind of scar on exactly 3 men in his life, and all 3 of them had earned it carrying something heavier than themselves out of a place they were not supposed to come back from. She caught him looking. She did not pull the sleeve down, and she did not explain it. She simply held his eye for a moment, calm as still water, and then handed him back the pad and returned to her bench. There was more if you knew where to look, and Ridley did. It was in the way she sat back down. Most people, when they lower themselves onto a bench, surrender their weight to it and let the thing hold them up. She did not. She folded down onto it with her feet still under her and her spine still stacked, so that she was resting on the bench without ever quite belonging to it, the way a person sits, who has spent a career being ready to be somewhere else in half a second. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that a man like Ridley had learned to read, the way a doctor reads a color in the skin. He had seen it in the old cadre, the ones with the quiet decorations they never mentioned, the ones who came back from the far places carrying something they set down for no one. He had never once seen it in a clerk. He drilled the class through 2 more techniques, and twice more, without meaning to, he glanced at the bench, and twice more, she was watching not the flashy man in the center, but the edges, the mistakes, the places where a body was about to betray itself. Once she murmured something to no one, so quietly that only Ridley, passing near, caught it. "He'll gas in 40 seconds. And 40 seconds later, the man she had not been looking at dropped his hands and bent at the waist and sucked wind, and Ridley felt the cold thread in his neck pull a little tighter. Ridley stood in the middle of the pit holding the pad and watching her sit, and he began to watch her the way a man watches a fuse he has just noticed is already lit. By the 3rd round of the morning, the joke had a name, and the name was cruel in the small way that catches on. "The tourist's still here," Brant announced to the ring, jerking his chin at the bench. The class had loosened by now, sweat steaming off their shoulders in the cold, and cruelty had become one of the ways they warmed themselves. "Come on, tourist. You've got notes, right? Grade us." "That's enough," Ridley said. "It's just talk, Sergeant." Brant spread his hands, all innocence. He drifted toward the bench as he spoke, orbiting her, letting the crowd feel him close the distance. "She likes it. She hasn't left. If she wanted us to knock it off, she'd say so. You'd say so, wouldn't you, ma'am?" He was standing over her now, close, tall, his shadow across her lap. And then, because the crowd was watching, and a crowd is a kind of hunger, he reached down and knocked her coffee off the end of the bench. It was a small thing. It was a boy's thing. The cup hit the sand, and the coffee soaked dark into it, and the ring hooted, and Brant turned to accept the noise like a man accepting a medal. The woman looked at the spilled coffee for a moment. Then she stood. She did not stand fast. She stood the way a wall would stand, if a wall could decide to. And when she was on her feet, she was not tall, and she was not broad, and there was nothing about her that should have made a strong young man take a half-step back. But Brant took the half-step back and hated himself for it, and covered it by laughing louder. "Whoa. Easy." He held up his hands, playing scared for the crowd, and the crowd loved it. "She's got some fight in her after all. Come on, tourist." Brant was warming to it now, and the ring was warming with him. "You keep grading everybody with those little looks. I see you." Tall guy shot bad. You gave him a look. I threw somebody. You gave me a look. So grade me out loud. What am I doing wrong, Professor? Enlighten the class. "You want to know what you're doing wrong," she said. It was not a question, and there was no anger in it, and that was somehow worse than anger would have been. The pit quieted a little to hear her, hungry for the fight. "No, you don't. You want me to say something you can laugh at. That's a different thing. When you actually want to know, ask a different way, and I'll tell you." For a heartbeat, Brant had no answer, because she had stepped around the trap instead of into it. And a crowd that has been promised, a victim grows restless when the victim will not bleed. He covered it the way he covered everything, with volume. "She talks like a fortune cookie," he announced, and the ring laughed, grateful to be given the ending back. A couple of the men picked it up, tossing the nickname between them now like a ball. Tourist, Professor, the fortune cookie on the bench, and the cruelty had that self-feeding quality that cruelty gets in a cold group of young men with something to prove and an easy target to prove it on. Only Dunmore, at the back, did not pick it up. He watched the woman take the words without a flinch, and he watched her not answer, and something about the completeness of her calm made his stomach turn over, though he could not have told anyone why. He had the sudden, unaccountable feeling of a man watching someone kick a sleeping dog and call it small. Specialist Brant. Ridley's voice cut across the pit now, with an edge that had not been there before. Fall in. Now. Brant fell in, grinning, and the moment passed, and the woman crouched and picked up her cup out of the sand and set it, empty, back on the bench, and folded her hands, and waited. But something had shifted in the air of the pit, and the men who were paying attention had stopped laughing, and the men who were not paying attention were about to learn the cost of it. If you have ever watched a young man mistake another person's patience for weakness and felt the whole thing coming and been unable to stop it, then you already know why this story matters, and you should stay with it to the end. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault and let it find the people who need it. Brant should have let it go. He almost did. But a crowd that has been given a victim does not release it easily, and by the time the class broke for water, he had decided that the only way to end the morning taller than he had begun it was to put the tourist in the sand where she belonged. "Live round," he said, loud, when they formed back up. "Sergeant, let me run a live round. Full speed. Somebody reel." He turned toward the bench before Ridley could answer, and he made it sound generous, made it sound like an honor. "Ma'am, 1 round. I'll go easy, I swear. You've got all these opinions about my hips. Come show me. Just once. Then I'll leave you alone all day." "Brant," Ridley stepped between them. "I said fall in. It's voluntary, Sergeant. If she says no, she says no." He smiled at the woman, and it was the smile of a man holding a door he knows the other person cannot walk through without shame. "You gonna say no in front of everybody? After all that?" The pit had gone quiet in the particular way that means everyone is enjoying something. They will later say they did not enjoy. The young Rangers watched her, waiting for the flinch. Only one of them was not enjoying it. Private First Class. Wyatt Dunmore, 20 years old, standing at the back with his arms crossed, was looking at the sand and wishing he were somewhere else, though he could not have said why. Something about the woman's calm had gotten under his skin in a way the crowd's noise never could. He had grown up on a cattle ranch in a dry country, and he had known since he was a boy a certain kind of stillness in animals and in men that meant the exact opposite of what it looked like it meant. His grandfather had a phrase for it: the quiet before the quiet. It was the way a thing got right before it moved, and the getting right was the whole warning. And if you had lived around it, you learned to feel it in the back of your teeth. Dunmore felt it now, in the cold pit, coming off the woman on the bench in waves, and he wanted to say something and didn't have the standing to say it, and so he did the only thing a private can do, which is watch and dread and hope one of the grown men figures it out before it is too late. The other men felt none of it. That was the thing about a crowd. A crowd was a set of eyes that all pointed the same direction, and the direction they pointed was at the show, and the show was Brant, big and loud and certain, and so the crowd saw only what Brant saw. It took a person standing a little apart, a little outside the warm circle of the joke, to see the woman clearly, and there were exactly 3 such people in that pit: an old sergeant first class, a ranch boy who did not belong yet, and the woman herself, who had been standing a little apart from every room she had ever entered since a cold mountain in 2012. The woman stood again. She unzipped the plain blue jacket and folded it over the bench with a care that looked almost like tenderness, and under it she wore a plain gray shirt, and on her feet were the kind of worn, sensible boots that no clerk had ever owned. She stepped to the edge of the sawdust and looked at Brant for a long moment, and when she spoke, it was not to refuse. "1 round," she said. "1 condition." "Name it." Brant was delighted. "Control." Her voice did not rise. "You do exactly what your sergeant would let you do to a soldier you outrank. Nothing more. Whatever happens, you keep your control. Can you do that?" "Yeah," he grinned at the ring. "Yeah, I can do that." "We'll see," she said, and stepped into the pit, and the frost-bright morning seemed to lean in around the sand to watch. Ridley did not call the round. He crossed the pit instead, fast, and caught Brant by the arm above the elbow and turned him half away from the crowd and put his mouth close to the young man's ear. "Son." Ridley's voice was very low and had lost all its parade ground flatness. There was something in it now that Brant had never heard from him, and it stopped the grin on his face like a hand over a candle. "You have no idea who that is," Brant tried to laugh. "She's a clerk, Sergeant. Look at her forearm." Ridley did not let go of his arm. "Look at how she's standing. Look at where her weight is. I have been doing this since before you could walk, and I am telling you, as the only favor you're going to get today, that you need to go get water and sit down, and thank God she said, control." Ridley did not often reach for a man. In 26 years, he had learned that the loud correction is the weak one, that the thing said quietly and close is the thing that lands. He had reached for exactly the kind of young soldier Brant was, more than once, on the edge of exactly the kind of mistake Brant was about to make. And he had learned that you cannot always pull them back, because the crowd has a stronger grip than you do. He knew it even as he held Brant's arm. He was trying anyway. "I have watched 3,000 men come through this pit," Ridley said, low and fast. "I have never once told any of them to walk away from a round. I am telling you, whatever you think you're looking at over there, you're wrong. And being wrong about that woman is the kind of wrong you don't get to take back. Go get water. Sit down. Let this be the smartest thing you ever did." For a second, something in Brant wavered. He looked at the woman standing at the center of the sawdust, hands loose at her sides, weight down, eyes quiet, and a cold thread of doubt went through him. Some animal part of him, the part older than pride, felt the wrongness Ridley was pointing at and wanted very badly to listen. But he was 24, and the crowd was watching, and the doubt could not survive the watching. He pulled his arm free. "It's 1 round, Sergeant." He rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck for the ring. "I'll be gentle." Ridley stepped back. His jaw was tight. And as he stepped back, he caught the eye of Dunmore at the rear of the pit and jerked his head, once, sharply, toward the compound headquarters up the hill. "Dunmore," he said quietly under the noise. "Go find the sergeant major. Tell him the new master trainer's already here. Tell him to come down to the pit. Now. Run." Dunmore did not understand it, but he understood the word run and the look on Ridley's face, and he went. And the woman in the center of the pit watched the boy sprint up the hill, and something almost like sorrow crossed her still face, because she had seen how this kind of morning ended more times than she wanted to count, and she took no joy in it anymore. "Whenever you're ready, specialist," she said. The class leaned in. Ridley stood with his arms crossed and his heart going hard, and the cold morning held its breath. What was about to happen in that pit had happened once before, in a place with no crowd and no laughter, and to understand why a strong young man was about to make the worst mistake of his short career, you have to go there first. Stay with it. Subscribe, so the rest of this finds you. The ridgeline had no name that any of them used. On the maps, it was a set of numbers and a contour line that bunched up tight where the mountain refused to be gentle. It was 2012. It was cold in the way that only altitude and night together can manage. A cold that got into the seams of things and stayed. And a 23-year-old sergeant named Renata Vaughn was moving up it in the dark with 11 other rangers. And one of them was a rifleman named Elias Mercer, who was 25 and had a laugh you could pick out of any room and a photograph of his mother taped inside his helmet. They were most of the way up when the mountain came apart. The first burst came from above and to the right, from a spur they had cleared on the map and not on the ground, and it took the patrol in the open. The night filled with the flat hammering that a person never forgets and can never quite describe, and the world narrowed to muzzle flash and the smell of hot metal and the shapes of men dropping to the cold rock. Vaughn had her back against a boulder and her rifle up and was calling positions before her mind had finished being afraid, because the training had gone in deeper than the fear, which is the only reason any of them ever come home. Then she heard Mercer. He was out in the open, past the boulder line, where the volume of fire was worst, and he was hit. She could hear it in the sound he made, the specific sound, the one that is not a scream, but is worse than a scream. And she did the arithmetic that every one of them prays they will never have to do, and knows that they might. The distance, the fire, the odds, the cost. And then she stopped doing arithmetic, because Mercer was one of hers, and she went and got him. There is a thing that happens to a certain kind of person at the worst moment of their life, and it does not look like courage from the inside. It looks like a great and terrible quiet. The noise goes away. The fear does not leave so much as step aside, politely, to let the necessary thing pass. Vaughn had felt it once before, in a lesser way, and she would feel it again. And each time it frightened her more than the fear had, because it meant a part of her had already accepted the cost and was simply getting on with the arithmetic of paying it. That quiet came down over her on the ridge, like a hand laid flat on the back of the neck, and she rose out of cover and went. She never afterward remembered the crossing. People who have done such things rarely do. The mind, in its mercy, keeps very little of the worst 40 meters a person ever moves. She remembered reaching him and getting a hand into his gear, and the impossible weight of a grown man in full kit going limp against her. And she remembered the moment the rounds found her right forearm and laid it open to the bone. The pain did not arrive the way pain is supposed to. It arrived as information, as a fact about her arm that she filed and set aside, and she kept her grip anyway, because letting go was not a thing her hand knew how to do. She got him up. She got him behind the boulder line, one boot digging, and then the next, the whole world reduced to the next meter of cold rock, and the weight against her chest, and the sound of him breathing that told her he was still there to be carried. She got a tourniquet on herself with her teeth and one hand, and cinched it against a rock, and got back on her rifle, because the fight was not over, and the others were still out there in the dark. And a leader who stops to bleed while her people are still in it is not a leader she had ever agreed to be. Mercer died against the cold rock, with her hand on his chest, in the last quiet minute before the birds came in and the mountain went silent. He was awake for most of it. His last words were not dramatic. They almost never are. He asked her to tell his mother he had not been scared, which was a lie, and she promised she would tell it, and she had kept that promise every year since. For that night, she was given the silver star, and a scar she would carry the rest of her life, and a name. The name came from a communications sergeant who had listened to the whole thing on the net, listened to a woman's voice stay level while she called fire, and dragged a dying man across open ground, and never once climbed toward panic, and who said afterward that her voice had been the only calm thing on the mountain, low and dark and steady, like Sable. The name stuck. In the regiment, among the small number of people who knew the story, Sable was not a joke. Sable was a thing you said quietly. And one of the people who knew the story, because he had been 40 meters down the ridge that night, with a bullet through the meat of his shoulder, watching a young sergeant do the thing that the rest of them would spend their lives hoping they had it in them to do, was a hard, thick-necked sergeant named Gideon Pell. He had lain in the rocks that night with his shoulder on fire and his rifle up, unable to move to her, and he had watched a young sergeant do the thing that every man in that unit had privately wondered whether he would have it in him to do, and he had wept once, quietly, in the dark, out of something too large to be only relief. He had carried the memory of it the way you carry a coin worn smooth, turning it over in bad moments. A proof that the standard was real, and that a human being had actually met it while he watched. He had never forgotten it. A man does not forget the person who held the line he was too hurt to hold. He had risen, in the years since, all the way to Command Sergeant Major, and he had told the story of the ridgeline exactly twice, both times to young Rangers who needed to understand what the standard actually was, and both times his voice had done something it didn't do for anything else. He did not use her name when he told it. He said only, "a sergeant," because the name felt like a thing you did not spend cheaply, and because some part of him believed that if he ever said it out loud in the wrong place, he might look up and find her standing there, and would not know what his own face would do. The scar on the forearm in the combatives' pit was the same scar. The pit did not know it was standing on history. It was about to find out. Brant shot first, and it was a good shot, low and fast, driving for her hips, and against almost anyone in that pit, it would have ended the round in his favor in under 2 seconds. She was not almost anyone. She met the shot the way water meets a stone thrown into it, folding around it instead of resisting it, and Brant felt his takedown arrive at a body that simply was not where his weight had committed to it being. He stumbled through the space where she had been. She let him. She could have ended it there, cleanly, and did not, because she had given a condition, and she intended to hold up her own end of it long past the point where he had abandoned his. Because Brant, humiliated by the miss, forgot control entirely. He came up ugly. He grabbed a fistful of her shirt and hauled her in, and got behind her, and locked a choke across her throat with everything he had, cranking it, not the controlled squeeze of a training round, but the real thing, the panicked, violent thing, meant not to score, but to make her tap in front of everyone, to put the tourist down in the sand and make the whole morning worth it. The crowd made a noise. Somewhere in it, Ridley was already moving, and already knew he would not get there in time. The woman did not claw at the arm across her throat the way the drowning do. She dropped her chin a half-inch, buying the sliver of air that a person who has been choked correctly 1,000 times knows how to buy. She set her feet, and then, for exactly 1 second, the stillness she had worn all morning like a coat came off, and the pit saw what was underneath it. It was not violence exactly. It was economy. It was a single, seamless motion that used Brant's own crank against the shoulder he had cranked it with, a rotation and a base and a lever, and it took Brant off his feet and over her hip and laid him out flat on his back in the sand, with her hand already at the point on his neck where a person can be finished, resting there, weightless, a promise and not a blow. It was so fast and so complete that the front row flinched backward as one body. It made no sound at all except the thud of Brant hitting the earth and the air leaving him. And then she stopped. She held there, one hand light on his throat, her knee across his chest, her eyes calm, and every man in the pit understood in the same instant that she had traveled the entire distance from a spilled cup of coffee to the ending of a human life in 1 second, and had chosen, at the last inch of it, not to arrive. She lifted her hand. She stood up off him. She stepped back and let him breathe. For 1 second, every man in that pit had seen exactly what she chose not to do, and the silence that followed was the silence of 30 people rearranging everything they thought they knew. That was the moment Command Sergeant Major Gideon Pell came around the corner of the equipment shed at the top of the pit, with Dunmore 2 steps behind him, and stopped. He had come down the hill fast and irritated, a big man in a hurry, already forming the words to greet the incoming master trainer and ask why nobody had told him she was on the compound a day early. The words were most of the way to his mouth, and then he saw her face across the sand, saw the plain gray shirt and the pale scar on the forearm, and the way she was standing over a young man in the sawdust with that particular stillness, and the words died, and every bit of the hurry and the irritation went out of him at once. The command sergeant major of the battalion, a man the entire compound had watched walk through worse mornings than this without breaking stride, went completely, absolutely still. The color left his face. His hand, halfway to a salute he had not consciously begun, hung in the air. He stood at the top of the pit and looked at the woman in the sand, as if he were looking at something that had walked out of a place the living do not walk out of, and for a moment, the hardest man on the compound could not make a sound. "Sergeant Major," one of the cadre said, uncertain. Pell did not hear him. He came down into the pit slowly, 1 step at a time, his eyes never leaving her, and the young rangers parted in front of him without understanding why, and he stopped a few feet from her and searched her face. And when he finally spoke, it was not loud at all. It was almost a whisper. It carried to every corner of the frozen pit anyway. "Sable." The woman met his eyes. Something passed between them that none of the young men would ever be able to touch, a whole cold mountain of it, and she inclined her head. "Hello, Gideon," she said quietly. "You've gotten old." "You carried Mercer down the ridge." Pell's voice cracked on the name, this man who did not crack. For a moment he was not a command sergeant major in a training pit at all. He was a hurt young sergeant in the rocks again, watching, and the 14 years between then and now folded up like a map and put the 2 moments face to face. He blinked it away. He straightened. He turned, slowly, to the pit full of young rangers, and his eyes found Brant, still on his back in the sand, propped on his elbows, his face gone the color of the frost. Ridley spoke into the silence because it needed to be said aloud and completely, and because he had earned the right to be the one who said it. "That scar on her arm," he said, his voice carrying flat and certain across the pit. "I've been trying to place it all morning. Now I have. That's the arm that carried a man 40 meters through open fire and didn't let go when it got shot through. There's a citation for it. Some of you have read it without knowing whose it was. This is Master Sergeant Renata Vaughn," Pell said, and now the parade ground volume came back into him, and it shook. "Silver Star, 2012. She is your incoming combatives master trainer. And in the year that I earned this rank, on a mountain I will not name, this woman crossed 40 meters of open fire on a shattered arm to bring one of ours home, and held the line after he was gone, while some of us bled in the rocks and prayed she had it in her. She did. She always did." Ridley, at the edge of the pit, closed his eyes for one long moment, and when he opened them, he was standing at attention. Brant's face went through the whole terrible distance in the space of 3 seconds. Confusion first, because the words did not fit the tourist, then disbelief, because they could not be true and were. Then recognition, as the scar and the stillness and the one impossible second in the sand all arrived at once and locked into place. And then horror, plain and total. The horror of a young man who has just understood exactly what he put his hands on, and exactly how close he came, and exactly who had chosen to let him breathe. Around the pit, one by one, and then all at once, the young rangers came to attention. The cadre came to attention. Pell came to attention and held it, and rendered to her the respect that the whole cold morning had been withholding. And the loudest man in the pit lay in the sand at her feet and could not find his voice at all. Specialist Cody Brandt was relieved from the pit before the sand had finished settling. It was not Vaughn who did it. She never said a word about consequences. It was his own chain, moving with the particular cold speed of an institution that has just watched one of its own disgrace it in front of a legend. His squad leader had him on his feet and out of formation inside a minute. His platoon sergeant met him at the top of the hill with a face like a closed door. There would be a counseling statement. There would be a reckoning that had nothing to do with the woman in the pit and everything to do with the fact that he had abandoned control in a training round and tried to choke out a soldier to win a morning. And every NCO who had ever corrected him was now going to correct him at once. The regiment does not forgive a broken word quickly, and control is a word a ranger gives. Brandt had given it out loud, in front of 30 witnesses, and then he had thrown it away the instant his pride was pricked. And there is no worse thing a young man can show his sergeants than that the size of his ego is larger than the size of his discipline. That was the charge against him, and it was true, and he knew it was true, and the knowing was already doing to him what no counseling statement ever could. He sat where they put him and stared at the ground and ran the morning backward in his mind, looking for the place he could have chosen differently, and finding that there had been a dozen such places, and that a quieter man had offered him nearly every one of them, and that he had trampled each one for the sound of a laugh. Word of it went through the compound the way such things go, quietly and completely, by the time the flags snapped in the noon wind. Not the mockery. The other thing. That the incoming master trainer was Sable. That the scar was the scar. That a boy had tried her, and she had held the whole terrible weight of what she could do in one open hand, above his throat, and then set it down. Men who had never met her began, that afternoon, to stand a little straighter when they passed the pit. If you have ever watched someone learn, all at once, and far too late, exactly what their contempt was aimed at, and felt that this is what justice is actually made of, then honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this story find the people who need it. The pit emptied slowly, the cold burned off, and Vaughn crouched by the low bench and picked her plain blue jacket back up off it, and shook the frost out of it, and stood holding it, looking at the place in the sand where the young man had lain. Pell came and stood beside her. For a while neither of them said anything. Two people who had been on the same mountain do not always need to. You could end him, Pell said at last, quietly. One word from you. After what he did, nobody would say a thing. I know. She watched a pair of ravens cross the gray sky over the tree line. I'm not going to. Why not? She was quiet a moment. Because I've seen the other kind of mourning, she said. The kind where somebody like that doesn't get a second one. Mercer was 25, Gideon. He was loud, too. He was cocky, too. He got about 4 more years than that boy's had, and then he didn't get any more mornings at all. She turned the jacket over in her hands. That specialist is a good ranger who hasn't been humbled yet. Now he's been humbled, That's not the end of a man. That's the start of one. If you break him today, you'll never find out which. Pell looked at her for a long moment, and then he almost smiled, which for him was a great deal. You haven't changed. I've gotten old, she said. Same as you. She found Brant an hour later at the top of the hill, sitting alone on a low wall, with his hands hanging between his knees and his whole body folded around his shame. He heard her boots on the gravel and stood up fast and came to attention so rigid it looked painful. Master Sergeant, His voice failed. He tried again. I don't have the words for it, ma'am. There aren't. I put my hands on you. I choked you. I could have. You didn't, she said. Because I decided you didn't. Remember that this is how close it always is, and how much of it is somebody else's mercy that you'll never see. She let that sit. Look at me, specialist. He looked at her. You've got fast hips and a strong base, and no idea what to do with your fear. So it comes out sideways as noise, she said. That's fixable. I've fixed worse. The question is whether you want it fixed, or whether you want to spend 20 years being the loudest man in every pit until one day you meet somebody who doesn't give you the second I gave you. She held out a roll of hand tape. I'll take you on. First student on the compound. But you learn the whole thing. And the first thing you learn is why the quiet ones are the ones to watch. Do we understand each other? Brant took the tape as if it weighed a great deal. Yes, Master Sergeant. Then be in the pit at 0600, and Brant. She was already turning away. The quiet ones are quiet, because they don't have anything left to prove. Try to get there before it costs you what it cost the rest of us. That evening, when the compound had gone still and the flag had come down, Vaughn walked out to the small memorial wall at the edge of the parade field, the one with the names of the battalion's dead cut into the dark stone. She found the name she always found first. She put 2 fingers against the cold letters of it, Elias Mercer, and stood there a while in the last of the light. Then she took out her phone, and she called a number she had called on this same evening every year for 14 years, and a woman named Carol Mercer answered on the second ring the way she always did. And Vaughn said, Hi, Carol, it's Wren. And she heard the older woman's breath catch and steady, the yearly ritual of it, grief worn smooth as a river stone. They talked for a long time. They always did. Carol asked about her arm, the way she asked every year, and Vaughn said it ached in the cold, the way she said every year, and neither of them said what they both knew, which was that the ache was a kind of company, a thing that had come down off the mountain with her and stayed. Vaughn told her about the new posting and the cold and the young rangers, how green they were and how sure of themselves, how they reminded her, some of them, of a rifleman with a laugh you could pick out of any room. She did not tell her about the pit. Carol did not need the pit. Carol needed only what she had needed for 14 years, which was to hear the voice of the last person her son had spoken to, and to be told, once a year, in the dark, the thing that let her sleep. And before they hung up, as she always did, Vaughn told Carol Mercer that her son had not been scared, and it was still a lie, and it was still the truest thing she ever said, because the fear had been real, up there in the cold, in all of them. But the fear had not been the last thing, and it had not been the largest thing, and a mother did not need to carry the fear when she could carry the other part instead, the part where a boy asked someone to tell his mother he was brave, which is the bravest thing a frightened person can think to do. That was what Vaughn gave her every year, not a lie exactly, a truer truth, chosen on purpose, and held. 6 weeks later, in the thin gray light of a morning that had not decided yet what it wanted to be, a young man stood at the edge of an empty pit, with his hands taped and his shoulders low, and asked a woman he had once mocked whether she had the time to teach him. I've got the time, she said. Warm up first. You still drop your hips a half-second late. and he nodded like a man who had been given something, because he had. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.